The Vampire King chose Maya from a lineup of terrified brides for his amusement, until she pressed a silver blade to his throat during their first kiss and smiled. What no one knew was that she'd been hunting his kind for centuries, and tonight she'd finally cornered the apex predator. Maya forced her shoulders to shake as she stood among the line of trembling women, their sobs echoing off the obsidian walls of the Vampire King's throne room like prayers to deaf gods. The scent of fear hung thick in the air, metallic and sharp, while 12 heartbeats hammered out different rhythms of terror. Hers remained steady, controlled, the product of decades spent hunting creatures far more dangerous than these court parasites who lounged in their silk and shadows. King Damien moved before them like a predator selecting prey, his ancient eyes catching torchlight as they swept over each face with casual cruelty. Maya catalogued every detail through lowered lashes. 17 guards positioned at strategic points, 3 exits not counting the windows 40 feet above, and a throne room designed to intimidate with its soaring arches and blood-stained marble. The Vampire King himself stood nearly 7 feet tall, his pale skin stretched over a frame that radiated centuries of accumulated power, dark hair falling in waves that framed a face beautiful enough to lure saints to damnation. This bride selection was theater, she knew, entertainment for a court grown bored with centuries of the same pleasures, a mockery of human traditions that would end with another mortal's public execution for sport. When his cold fingers lifted her chin, forcing her to meet those predatory eyes, Maya summoned tears and let her voice break as she whispered, "Please," in the most fragile tone she could manage. The word hung in the air like a butterfly with torn wings. Damien's laugh was liquid darkness, rich and pleased, as he announced to his assembled court that this trembling flower would serve as his temporary queen. Applause erupted from the vampire nobility, sharp and mocking as breaking glass, while Maya bowed her head to hide the satisfied smile that threatened to betray her carefully constructed facade. She had just become the hunter who had willingly walked into the dragon's den, and the dragon had no idea that his newest toy carried silver teeth. The ornate chambers assigned to Maya reeked of previous occupants' terror, their fear soaked so deeply into the blood-red tapestries that even silver-threaded blessed cloth couldn't mask the stench completely. Vampire attendants dressed her with the casual efficiency of undertakers preparing a corpse, their pale hands moving silk and lace while they discussed her inevitable demise in voices that carried centuries of practiced cruelty. Maya played her part perfectly, the traumatized peasant bride asking innocent questions about the castle's layout that any terrified girl might pose while seeking comfort or escape routes. How many? Servants worked the kitchens, and when did they change shifts? Where did the guards patrol and at what intervals? Which corridors led to the stables and how many horses were kept ready for travel? Each answer painted a clearer picture of her battlefield, while she maintained the facade of a broken soul seeking any small mercy. Through the barred windows, she spotted the ancient oak tree where Damien had executed his last 3 wives, their bones still visible in the twisted roots that had grown fat on Vampire King's entertainment. Each had lasted only days before boring him, their novelty wearing thin like paint in rain. The attendants spoke of these previous brides with the detached interest of critics discussing failed performances, debating whether the screaming or the begging had been more amusing before the final act. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in his private study, Damien entertained his inner circle with elaborate plans for Maya's humiliation, describing how he would drain her slowly over weeks to maximize the entertainment value for his court. He envisioned public feedings where she would beg for mercy that would never come, theatrical presentations of her degradation that would remind his subjects why defying their king meant death. His lieutenants laughed and offered suggestions, each more creative than the last in their casual cruelty. What none of them knew was that Maya's wedding dress had been crafted by her mentor before his death, blessed silver threads woven so fine they were invisible to vampire sight, but would burn undead flesh at the slightest contact. The family heirloom necklace resting against her throat contained not pearls, but hollow chambers filled with holy water, concentrated enough to eat through vampire skin like acid. Every piece of jewelry, every decoration, every seeming ornament was a weapon waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. Maya had spent 3 centuries preparing for this night, and she had come armed for war disguised as surrender. The Gothic cathedral stretched before Maya like the throat of some massive stone beast, its vaulted ceilings lost in shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life, while hundreds of vampire nobility filled the pews with their sneering faces and predatory smiles. Torchlight danced across stained glass windows that depicted scenes of human submission to vampire rule, each panel a propaganda piece designed to remind mortals of their place in the natural order. Maya walked down the aisle flanked by undead guards, whose hands rested casually on sword hilts, playing her part as the sacrificial lamb led to slaughter, while internally mapping every face in the crowd, every weapon within reach, every potential ally or threat among the assembled court. The ancient vows were spoken in Latin by a corrupted priest whose eyes had long since gone red with vampiric transformation, binding her to Damien until death, which everyone present assumed would come very soon indeed. Thunder rolled outside the cathedral as if nature herself protested this unholy union, rain beginning to drum against the windows like fingers of the desperate dead seeking entry. During the ring exchange, Maya allowed her hand to tremble convincingly as she slid the cursed silver band onto Damien's finger, a circle blessed by Vatican hunters and inscribed with symbols that would slowly drain his strength like poison seeping through his undead veins. He felt nothing yet, the magic too subtle for immediate detection, but within hours his supernatural speed would begin to falter and his legendary strength would crack like ice in spring. The kiss that sealed their union tasted of copper pennies and winter nights, cold lips that had spoken 1,000 lies pressed against hers, while lightning split the sky outside. In that moment, as his guard was down and his attention focused on the theater of domination, Maya pressed the concealed silver blade to his throat with surgical precision and smiled against his mouth before whispering the words that would shatter his world like glass hitting stone. "Hello, husband," she breathed, her voice carrying 3 centuries of patient fury and deadly purpose. "I have been hunting you since the night you murdered my family and burned my village to ash, tracking you across continents and through the shadows of a dozen kingdoms, until finally I have cornered the apex predator in his own den." The blade burned his throat where it touched, silver blessed by dying saints and sharpened on the bones of his previous victims, and for the first time in over a millennium, the Vampire King felt the cold touch of genuine fear. Damien's body turned to marble beneath Maya's blade, every muscle locked in disbelief as silver fire burned across his throat, like liquid starlight, the pain sharp and immediate in ways he had forgotten were possible after centuries of invulnerability. His court sat frozen in their pews, faces slack with shock that bordered on religious terror, as if witnessing their god bleed for the first time and finding their faith shattered by the sight. Maya felt the tremor that ran through his frame, the involuntary flinch of a predator, suddenly recognizing another apex hunter in what he had assumed was harmless prey, and she pressed her advantage with the cold precision her mentor had drilled into her bones. She was the last daughter of the Valdris bloodline, she told him in a voice that carried across the cathedral like a funeral bell, trained from childhood in arts older than his kingdom and deadlier than his darkest nightmares. For 300 years she had tracked him across continents, studying his patterns like a scholar devoted to a single text, learning his habits and weaknesses with the patience of stone wearing away mountains. Every village he had burned, every life he had claimed, every act of casual cruelty had been catalogued and filed away in her memory like evidence for a trial that was finally beginning. This terrified peasant girl had been a performance worthy of the greatest theaters. Every tear calculated for maximum effect, every trembling word designed to feed his arrogance, until it blinded him to the predator hiding beneath fragile skin. When the guards finally shook themselves from their stupor and moved to intervene, hands reaching for swords and fangs extending in protective fury, Maya exploded into motion that blurred the line between human speed and something far more dangerous. Hunter magic sang through her veins like molten gold, generations of accumulated power awakening in response to mortal danger, and suddenly she was no longer the trembling bride, but something that moved like lightning given flesh and purpose. The first guard reached her as she spun away from Damien, his blade whistling through empty air, while her elbow found his throat with surgical precision, crushing his windpipe before he could scream. The second fell to a backhand strike that sent him crashing into stone pillars with enough force to crack marble, while the third found her boot connecting with his chest hard enough to stop his undead heart for several agonizing seconds. She could end Damien now, Maya knew, drive the blessed silver deep enough to find his heart and finish the hunt that had consumed her entire existence. But she had spent too many years planning this moment to waste it on simple assassination. "We are going to play a game, my king," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once commanded armies and toppled kingdoms. The blade pressed deeper into his throat, drawing a thin line of blood that hissed and steamed where silver met vampire flesh, while her eyes held his with the intensity of a judge pronouncing sentence. "If you win, I will let you kill me as slowly as your imagination can devise," she continued, each word measured and deliberate as coins placed on a dead man's eyes. "But if I win, you will kneel before your court and acknowledge me as your equal before renouncing the throne that has been built on centuries of innocent blood, and perhaps we will see if a monster can learn to be something more than the sum of his hungers." The deadly contest Maya proposed sent ripples of outrage through the vampire court like stones thrown into still water, their voices rising in protest that bordered on panic as they realized their invincible king was being challenged by what they had assumed was merely dinner with delusions of grandeur. 7 nights of challenges, she explained with the patient tone of a teacher instructing particularly slow students, each designed to test not just their physical abilities, but their cunning, their will, their capacity to adapt and overcome when stripped of every advantage except raw determination. Each night, one of them would set a test for the other, the rules limited only by imagination, and the requirement that victory be possible for either party, given sufficient skill and intelligence. If Damien won 4 challenges, she would submit to whatever execution he devised, accepting death as the price of her failure to complete the hunt that had defined her existence. If she won 4, he must publicly kneel and acknowledge her as his equal, before renouncing his throne and the casual cruelty that had marked his reign for over a millennium. The court erupted in voices that ranged from furious disbelief to nervous laughter. Vampires who had never questioned their king's supremacy suddenly faced with the possibility that their carefully ordered world might be built on foundations of sand. But Damien found himself intrigued, despite every instinct screaming that he should simply tear her throat out and be done with this unprecedented challenge to his authority. No one had dared stand against him in centuries, not since the last rebellion had been crushed so thoroughly that the survivors still woke screaming from nightmares of his retribution, and the novelty of genuine opposition sparked something in his ancient soul that he had thought dead forever. "Very well," he agreed, his voice carrying the weight of absolute confidence, even as silver continued to burn his throat like concentrated starlight. "I accept your terms, little hunter, though I suspect you will find that 3 centuries of preparation mean nothing against 1,000 years of accumulated power, and the kind of cruelty that has made kings kneel and armies break like waves against stone." Maya's first challenge was elegantly simple in its deadly implications. Survive until dawn while she hunted him through his own castle, turning the familiar corridors and chambers into a labyrinth where every shadow might conceal death, and every doorway could become a trap. The rules were clear and merciless, she would have 6 hours to kill him, using any means at her disposal, short of bringing down the castle itself, while he needed only to remain alive until the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern towers. As midnight struck with the ominous weight of fate itself, Maya smiled and stepped backward into shadows that seemed to swallow her whole, leaving Damien alone in his cathedral with the sudden, horrible realization that for the first time in over a millennium, he was prey instead of predator. Maya moved through Damien's castle like a ghost seeking vengeance, her hunter training allowing her to navigate corridors she had only seen once while maintaining perfect silence on marble floors that would betray the slightest misstep to vampire hearing. She had memorized every secret passage during her brief tour as the frightened bride, catalogued every trap and weakness in defenses that had been designed to keep armies out, but never anticipated a single infiltrator who knew exactly where to strike. The blessed silver threads woven into her wedding dress caught moonlight like spiderwebs touched with dew, while the holy water in her necklace remained ready to burn vampire flesh if stealth failed, and she needed to fight her way to freedom. Damien fled through his own domain with mounting desperation, the hunter's presence a constant weight pressing against his consciousness, like a blade held at his throat, even when she remained invisible in the shadows that suddenly seemed deeper and more threatening than they had ever been in centuries of rule. His supernatural speed meant nothing when every doorway could conceal an ambush, his legendary strength useless against an enemy who struck and vanished before he could retaliate, leaving only the scent of silver and determination to mark her passing. She used techniques passed down through generations of Valdris hunters, methods refined through centuries of stalking creatures far stronger and faster than any human had a right to challenge, forcing him to experience the terror that his victims had known in their final moments when death wore a beautiful face and spoke in honeyed lies. When she finally cornered him in his private study, emerging from behind a tapestry that depicted his greatest military victories, with the silent grace of justice finally arriving to collect its due, they engaged in combat that was less battle than natural disaster, contained within stone walls. Priceless artifacts shattered under the impact of bodies moving at speeds that blurred the line between possible and impossible. Ancient books torn and scattered like autumn leaves, while furniture that had survived centuries of careful preservation became kindling in seconds. Maya's blessed silver blade carved lines of fire across Damien's chest and arms, each cut burning with holy light that made his undead flesh smoke and hiss, while his claws opened gashes along her ribs and shoulders that painted the floor with blood that sparkled faintly with hunter magic. They were nearly equal in this dance of violence, her supernatural enhancements allowing her to match his vampire strength, while her training gave her an edge in technique that his raw power couldn't entirely overcome, but time was her enemy as much as he was. As dawn approached with the inevitability of gravity, Maya made her choice and retreated through a window that opened onto the castle's outer walls, leaving Damien bloodied and shaking in the ruins of his sanctuary, while the first rays of sunlight began to paint the eastern sky with gold and crimson. He had won by surviving, but the cost to his ego was catastrophic, visible in the way he limped and the tremor in his hands that no amount of vampire healing could immediately repair. His court witnessed their invincible king reduced to something pitifully mortal, wounded and humiliated by a single human woman who had turned their absolute monarch into prey for 6 hours, and left him grateful simply to see another sunrise. And in that moment, the power dynamic that had ruled their world for a millennium began to shift like tectonic plates grinding against each other before an earthquake that would reshape everything they thought they knew about strength and submission. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Damien's revenge took the form of an elegant banquet that stretched across the castle's great hall like a tableau painted in blood and candlelight, where vampire nobles gathered around tables laden with delicacies that no mortal throat could swallow, while Maya sat in the place of honor at his right hand, bound by silver chains, blessed with just enough holy power to burn without causing permanent damage. The psychological warfare he had chosen was designed to strip away every defense she had built around her heart, to crack the clinical detachment that allowed her to function as a weapon against his kind, and reveal the grieving woman beneath. Each vampire lord and lady had been carefully selected for the stories they could tell, tales of Valdres hunters they had slaughtered over the centuries, family members whose screams still echoed in halls older than kingdoms. Lady Serena began with Maya's great-grandmother, describing in loving detail how the woman had begged for her children's lives, even as vampire claws opened her throat, while Duke Morvain shared the exquisite agony of Maya's cousin Elena, a promising young hunter whose training had been cut short when she was turned and forced to kill her own mentor before being granted the mercy of final death. Each tale was calculated to break Maya's spirit, to force her to confront the futility of her crusade against creatures who had been perfecting cruelty since before her ancestors learned to walk upright. But she responded to each horror with the kind of clinical detachment that a physician might show while examining particularly interesting symptoms. She asked clarifying questions about hunting techniques that had failed, inquired about the locations where artifacts had been hidden and subsequently lost, gathered intelligence with the methodical precision of a scholar, compiling research, even as the vampires described the deaths of everyone she had ever loved. When Count Ravencrest, a creature whose sadism was legendary even among his own kind, began describing in exquisite detail how he had tortured Maya's mentor to death over the course of 7 nights, breaking every bone in the old man's body before finally allowing him to die, Maya simply smiled and requested more wine, as if she were listening to poetry readings rather than accounts of loved ones being butchered for sport. The smile never wavered, even as Ravencrest described how her mentor had called her name in his final moments, begging forgiveness for failing to complete her training, and Damien felt something cold settle in his chest as he realized that she was either completely broken beyond any hope of repair or far more dangerous than even he had imagined possible. The woman sitting beside him showed no trace of the grief and rage that should have consumed any normal person hearing such accounts, her composure so complete it seemed carved from ice. And for the first time since accepting her challenge, Damien began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake in underestimating exactly what 3 centuries of focused hatred could forge from human clay. Maya's second challenge came with Dawn's approach, when she led Damien to the castle's highest tower, where hunter artifacts waited in careful arrangement around a circle carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, their meaning older than written language and more dangerous than any physical weapon could ever be. The memory magic she invoked was torture designed specifically for creatures who had spent centuries carefully forgetting their mortal origins, a spell that would force him to relive every human moment he had buried beneath layers of vampire cruelty and supernatural indifference. She spoke words in the old tongue that made reality bend and crack around them like glass under pressure, compelling him to remember not just the facts of his mortal life, but the emotions that had driven every choice, every moment of joy and sorrow that had shaped the man he was before darkness claimed him forever. The memories hit him like physical blows, starting with his wife's face on their wedding day, the way sunlight had caught in her hair like spun gold while she promised to love him until death separated them, unaware that death would prove to be merely the beginning of their tragedy rather than its end. He remembered his children's laughter, echoing through halls that would later run red with blood, the weight of his infant daughter in his arms as she reached for his face with tiny fingers that would never grow old enough to understand why her father had abandoned them for immortal hunger. The slow decay of his humanity played out in excruciating detail, each moral compromise that led him deeper into darkness. Each innocent life he had taken as the vampire curse reshaped his capacity for empathy into something cold and predatory. The vulnerability was agony for someone who had cultivated only cruelty and power for over a millennium, stripping away every defense he had built around his undead heart and forcing him to confront the man he had been before choosing to become a monster. But the spell backfired in ways Maya had not anticipated, because as she channeled the magic that compelled his memories to surface, she became witness to every moment of his mortal existence, seeing glimpses of genuine love and sacrifice that complicated her black and white view of him as pure evil beyond any hope of redemption. She watched him weep over his wife's grave, promising her spirit that he would protect their children no matter the cost, unaware that the vampire who had turned him was already moving pieces into place to corrupt that very promise into something monstrous. She felt his anguish as the blood hunger grew stronger each night, his desperate attempts to resist the urges that demanded he feed on the innocent, his final choice to leave his family rather than risk harming them in a moment of weakness. When he finally broke free from the spell's hold, collapsing to his knees as centuries of buried emotion crashed over him like a tide that threatened to drown what remained of his sanity, there was something almost grateful in his ancient eyes, as if remembering love was worth the agony of knowing he had lost it forever. Maya stared down at him with confusion warring against the certainty that had driven her for 3 centuries, because the memories she had witnessed showed not a creature born to evil, but a man who had made impossible choices in circumstances that offered only different forms of damnation. And for the first time since beginning her hunt, she wondered if the monster she sought to destroy might be capable of something approaching redemption. Damien's second challenge revealed the elegant cruelty that had made him legendary among his kind, a test designed not to break Maya's body, but to shatter the moral foundations that separated her from the monsters she hunted with such unwavering determination. He led her to the castle's dungeons, where a human prisoner waited in chains, a brigand whose crimes against innocent travelers had earned him a death sentence in any civilized court, his hands stained with the blood of merchants and pilgrims who had trusted the wrong roads on dark nights. The challenge was simple in its devastating implications. Maya must feed from this criminal to prove that she was no better than the vampires she claimed to despise, that beneath her righteous facade lay the same capacity for taking life that drove every predator in his court. The brigand was scum, who deserved death for his crimes against the innocent, Damien explained, with the reasonable tone of a judge pronouncing sentence, and drinking his blood would be justice rather than murder, a service to the world that would rid it of someone whose continued existence served no purpose except to spread suffering and fear. Maya's refusal came without hesitation, her moral code as immutable as natural law, even when faced with a victim whose death might genuinely benefit the world, and she maintained that position even as Damien threatened to slaughter every human servant in the castle unless she proved her willingness to cross the line that separated hunter from monster. The servants were innocent, she pointed out with calm logic that cut through his rage like blessed silver, and killing them to force her compliance would only prove that his evil was absolute while hers remained bounded by principles that even death could not break. For long moments that stretched like years, Damien stood poised between action and restraint, his court watching in fascinated horror as their savage king wrestled with impulses that warred against something deeper, something that might have once been called conscience before centuries of bloodshed buried it beneath layers of calculated cruelty. In a moment that surprised everyone, including himself, he relented, waving away the guards who had moved to carry out his threat with the casual gesture of someone dismissing servants rather than countermanding an order that would have resulted in dozens of deaths. He told himself that her integrity amused him, that watching her maintain impossible moral standards in a world that rewarded only the strong was entertainment enough to justify sparing the castle's staff. But something deeper stirred in the ancient hollow where his heart had once beaten with human rhythm. It was reluctant respect for someone who would choose death rather than compromise the principles that defined her existence, admiration for a strength that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with the kind of moral courage that he had abandoned the night he chose immortality over integrity. The vampire court watched in stunned disbelief as their savage king showed something that might have been mercy, the first crack in the facade of absolute ruthlessness that had defined his reign for over a millennium. And Maya found herself staring at him with new understanding of the complexity that lay beneath his monstrous exterior, wondering if the man she had glimpsed in his memories might still exist somewhere beneath centuries of accumulated darkness. Maya's third challenge required an artifact that had not seen daylight for centuries, a crystal sphere carved from meteoric stone that pulsed with inner light the color of dying stars, its surface etched with runes that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, like living things hungry for truth. The sphere of Viridian compelled absolute honesty from anyone who touched its surface, stripping away every lie and self-deception until only naked truth remained, regardless of how painful or damaging that truth might prove to be. She placed it on the stone table between them in Damien's private chambers, where portraits of long-dead kings watched from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow every movement, as if the dead themselves had gathered to witness this unprecedented moment of vulnerability between hunter and vampire. Under the sphere's influence, they would each ask 3 questions that must be answered with complete honesty, no matter how much damage those answers might inflict on carefully constructed facades or cherished beliefs about themselves and their enemies. Maya's first question cut straight to the heart of everything she thought she knew about vampire nature, asking why he had killed his own maker, the ancient creature who had given him immortal life and supernatural power beyond mortal comprehension. Damien's answer came without his permission, the words, torn from his throat by magic older than kingdoms, as he described the disgust that had consumed him when he realized what his maker truly was. Not a sophisticated predator, elevated above mortal concerns, but a creature so consumed by hunger and sadism that it had forgotten everything that once made existence meaningful. He had destroyed the thing that created him not out of rebellion, but out of revulsion for what he was being shaped into, a mercy killing that had freed them both from a relationship built on nothing but predation and cruelty. The second question revealed something even more shocking, that for decades he had actively searched for a way to die honorably, seeking out legendary hunters and ancient artifacts that might finally grant him the peace that immortality had made impossible to achieve through natural means. Her third question, delivered with the clinical precision of a surgeon making a crucial incision, asked why he had chosen her specifically from all the possible brides his court could have provided for his entertainment. The answer shattered every assumption she had made about their encounter, because he admitted that he had researched her reputation as thoroughly as she had studied his, choosing her precisely because her skills as a hunter promised that she might finally be worthy enough to end his existence with the dignity that centuries of lesser opponents had failed to provide. When the sphere's power turned to Maya, Damien's questions proved equally devastating to her carefully constructed worldview, beginning with the simple query about what had driven her to become a hunter in the first place. She was forced to relive that terrible night when she was 7 years old, watching vampires slaughter her entire village for sport while she hid in the grain cellar, emerging hours later to find everyone she loved reduced to drained corpses arranged in mockery of their final prayers. His second question demanded to know exactly how many vampires she had killed over 3 centuries of relentless hunting, and the number that emerged from her lips shocked even her with its magnitude. Over 200 creatures destroyed by her hand, each death catalogued and remembered with the precision of a scholar, maintaining detailed records of her crusade against his kind. The final question cut deepest of all, asking whether part of her had begun to understand why some humans chose to become vampires rather than face the brevity and vulnerability of mortal existence. And she was horrified to hear herself admit that, yes, there were moments when the appeal of immortal strength and freedom from human weakness had whispered to her in voices that sounded disturbingly reasonable. The revelations left both shaken to their cores, their carefully maintained certainties crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to flame as they stared at each other across a table that now seemed to separate two people who were far more alike than either had ever wanted to acknowledge. For his third challenge, Damien led Maya beyond the castle walls to a village that nestled in the valley below, like a handful of gemstones scattered across green velvet, its cobblestone streets and thatched cottages so perfectly ordinary that they seemed to exist in a different world from the Gothic nightmare of his stronghold. The complexity of his rule became apparent as soon as they entered the settlement, because despite the reputation for cruelty that had made his name synonymous with terror across a dozen kingdoms, these humans showed no fear when their vampire king walked among them with something approaching respect rather than the cowering submission she had expected to witness. He revealed that for over a century, he had maintained strict laws preventing any vampire attacks on these particular mortals, creating a system where willing blood donors provided sustenance in exchange for protection from other supernatural threats that prowled the darkness beyond his domain. It was symbiosis rather than simple predation, a careful balance that allowed both species to coexist without the constant cycle of violence that defined vampire-human relations everywhere else in the civilized world. Maya was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that he was simultaneously monster and protector, a creature capable of casual cruelty, who had also chosen to shield these innocents from horrors far worse than his own controlled hunger. The village showed signs of prosperity that spoke to benevolent leadership rather than tyrannical oppression, with well-maintained buildings, healthy children playing in the streets, and adults who worked their trades without the constant fear that marked communities living under vampire rule elsewhere. When raiders attacked the village at sunset, emerging from the forest with weapons gleaming and voices raised in bloodthirsty war cries, Maya found herself fighting alongside Damien to defend innocent lives without conscious thought or moral debate, her hunter instincts recognizing that these bandits represented a greater threat to the helpless than the vampire king who had sworn to protect them. Their coordination in battle was seamless in ways that should have been impossible between natural enemies. Centuries of combat experience creating an unexpected harmony that allowed them to move like dancers, following music only they could hear. She covered his left flank while he guarded her right, their fighting styles complementing each other with the precision of weapons forged specifically to work in tandem. And when the last raider fell to their combined assault, Maya realized that they had just fought together with the kind of trust that usually took years to develop between warriors. Afterward, a small girl with dirt-smudged cheeks and eyes bright with unshed tears approached to thank Maya for saving her mother from the bandits' blades, her innocent gratitude cutting through every philosophical argument about the nature of good and evil with the brutal simplicity of a child's understanding that someone had protected her family when they needed help most. As Maya knelt to accept the girl's awkward embrace, feeling small arms wrap around her neck with the desperate intensity of someone who had almost lost everything, she realized that her black and white worldview was crumbling like a house built on foundations of sand, leaving her to navigate moral territory far more complex than anything her training had prepared her to understand. As the fourth night approached, with the inevitability of storm clouds gathering on distant horizons, both Maya and Damien found their certainties wavering like candle flames in wind that threatened to extinguish everything they thought they knew about themselves and their eternal conflict. Maya struggled with the growing realization that Damien was not the pure embodiment of evil she had spent 3 centuries hunting, but rather a complex being shaped by isolation and the crushing burden of immortal responsibility. Someone who had made terrible choices, but retained enough humanity to protect innocence and seek redemption through honorable death. The vampire she had planned to destroy was capable of mercy, of sacrifice, of something that might even be called love, if she was willing to acknowledge the evidence her own eyes had shown her in stolen moments, when his mask slipped and revealed glimpses of the man he had been before darkness claimed him. Damien faced something even more disturbing than philosophical uncertainty, because his growing attraction to Maya's strength and unwavering principles was awakening feelings he had assumed died with his mortality. Emotions that made him vulnerable in ways that no physical weapon could ever achieve. She represented everything he had lost when he chose immortality over death. The moral courage and unshakable integrity that had been sacrificed on the altar of supernatural power. And watching her maintain those qualities in the face of every temptation and threat made him remember what it felt like to believe in something greater than personal survival. During a tense conversation in his private chambers, where firelight painted shadows that danced across walls lined with books that chronicled 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge and regret, they found themselves drawn together by forces neither fully understood or wanted to acknowledge. The air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with their respective roles as hunter and prey, a magnetic pull that drew them closer despite every rational argument about the impossibility of connection between natural enemies. When their faces were inches apart, and Maya could feel the coolness of his breath against her lips, while his hands framed her face with surprising gentleness, they nearly kissed before both pulled away in horror, each recognizing the betrayal of their respective natures that such intimacy would represent. The moment hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread, heavy with implications neither was prepared to confront, before they retreated to opposite sides of the room, as if physical distance could somehow undo the recognition of mutual attraction that had passed between them like lightning seeking ground. The vampire court began to whisper that their king was falling under the hunter's spell, their voices carrying the kind of speculation that could topple kingdoms if allowed to spread unchecked, while Maya found herself questioning whether her mission of vengeance was worth destroying someone who might be capable of genuine change, someone whose death would eliminate not just a monster, but also the protector of innocent lives and perhaps the last hope for peaceful coexistence between their kinds. The foundation of hatred that had supported her existence for 3 centuries was cracking under the weight of complexity she had never anticipated, leaving her to wonder if the greatest tragedy would be completing her hunt or abandoning it when victory was finally within reach. Maya's fourth challenge required magic that pushed the boundaries of what hunter traditions considered possible or wise. Ancient spells that could temporarily sever the supernatural bonds tying Damien's consciousness to his vampiric nature, and force him to experience mortality in all its vulnerable, terrifying glory. She spoke words in the old tongue that made reality shimmer and bend around them like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone, her voice growing stronger as power flowed through channels carved into her very soul by generations of Valdris hunters who had preserved these dangerous techniques for moments when nothing else would suffice. The spell stripped away his vampire nature layer by layer, like peeling bark from a tree, revealing the mortal man beneath centuries of accumulated darkness and supernatural enhancement, until he stood before her as human as the day he had first drawn breath over a millennium ago. The vulnerability that crashed over him was immediate and overwhelming, his enhanced senses dulling to mortal limitations, while strength that could shatter stone became merely that of a fit human male, leaving him feeling blind and weak in ways he had forgotten were possible. Hunger gnawed at his belly with unfamiliar insistence, not the clean burn of bloodthirst, but the complex demands of a mortal body that required actual sustenance rather than just the life force of others. And when Maya offered him bread and cheese from the kitchen stores, he discovered flavors and textures that had been impossible to appreciate through vampire senses, designed only to detect the quality of blood flowing through living veins. Sunlight streaming through the chamber windows touched his skin without the burning agony that had defined his existence for centuries. Warming flesh that remembered how to feel pleasure in simple sensations rather than just the predatory satisfaction of successful hunts. The experience awakened dormant emotions that vampire nature had suppressed or corrupted, allowing him to feel wonder at the way dust motes danced in afternoon light, genuine laughter at Maya's dry observations about his stumbling attempts to navigate mortality, and something that might have been peace as evening approached, and he realized that fear of death could coexist with appreciation for life in ways his immortal existence had never permitted. When vampire enemies attacked the castle at sunset, drawn by supernatural senses that detected their king's sudden vulnerability, like sharks sensing blood in water, Maya defended him with desperate ferocity that surprised them both, her hunter training unleashed not to destroy vampires, but to protect one who should have been her natural enemy. She fought with the kind of controlled fury that had made her legendary among her kind. Blessed silver dancing through vampire flesh, while holy water burned away attackers who thought to claim territory from a temporarily weakened king, and Damien watched in amazement as someone who had every reason to let him die instead risked everything to ensure his survival. The day ended, with them standing together against his own rebelling court, nobles who had sensed weakness and moved to exploit what they assumed was an opportunity to claim power for themselves. And for the first time in centuries, Damien understood what it meant to trust another being completely, to place his very existence in hands that could have crushed him, but chose instead to shield him from those who would see him destroyed for their own advancement. Damien's final challenge was the most dangerous proposition either of them had yet contemplated, a test that went beyond physical prowess or mental acuity to strike at the very heart of what made survival possible in a world where trust was luxury that predators could not afford. He demanded that Maya lower all her defenses and trust him completely for 1 hour. No weapons concealed in clothing that had become familiar as armor. No magic humming through blessed silver and holy artifacts. No backup plans or escape routes that might offer salvation if his nature proved stronger than whatever strange bond had developed between them over these impossible nights. Complete vulnerability to someone who could destroy her in seconds, whose strength could snap her neck before she could draw breath to scream, whose fangs could drain her life in moments that would feel like eternity as consciousness faded into the darkness that claimed all mortals in the end. Maya agreed with the kind of calm determination that had carried her through 3 centuries of impossible hunts, removing her silver jewelry piece by piece until the protective barriers she had worn like a second skin were scattered across his desk like discarded shells from some exotic sea creature. The blessing-infused weapons that had never left her side since childhood were set aside with the reverence due to sacred relics, while protective charms woven into her very clothing were carefully unpicked and placed beyond reach, leaving her as defenseless as any mortal woman who had wandered too far from civilization and found herself alone with a predator whose mercy was the only thing standing between life and death. They spent the hour in his private chambers talking about losses that had shaped them both, regrets that had accumulated like sediment in the deepest parts of their souls, and the impossible situation that had brought them together despite every law of nature and tradition that said their kinds could never coexist as anything but hunter and prey. Damien spoke of the children he had abandoned when the vampire curse claimed him, wondering if they had grown old and died while he wandered through centuries of darkness, pursuing power that felt increasingly hollow with each passing decade. Maya described the mentor who had trained her from childhood only to die screaming in vampire claws, leaving her to complete a hunt that had consumed her entire existence and defined every choice she had made since reaching adulthood. When the hour was nearly complete, and Damien could easily have killed her with a casual gesture, fulfilling every expectation their respective natures demanded, he instead shared his most carefully guarded secret, revealing the location of an ancient artifact hidden in tombs beneath the castle that could strip away his immortality permanently and return him to the mortal existence he had abandoned so long ago. Maya realized with crystalline clarity that this was not just trust, but surrender of the most complete kind possible, because he was offering her the ultimate victory, not because death held appeal, but because he wanted her to have the choice, to decide whether the monster she had hunted for centuries deserved destruction, or if the man she had glimpsed beneath layers of darkness might be worth preserving in whatever form remained possible. With the challenges tied at 3 victories each, the vampire court was forced to break the deadlock through a vote that would determine not just the outcome of their contest, but the fundamental nature of their society and its relationship with the mortal world that existed beyond castle walls. Maya had won them over not through the fear and intimidation that typically governed vampire politics, but through something far more dangerous to creatures who had built their existence on assumptions of natural superiority over mortal prey. Her honor in combat had been evident from the first night when she could have killed their king, but chose instead to propose a more complex test of worth, while her protection of Damien during his vulnerable day as a mortal had demonstrated loyalty that transcended the boundaries between hunter and hunted. Her refusal to show the cruelty they had expected from someone trained from childhood. Destroy their kind had forced them to acknowledge that not all humans were the simple prey animals they had assumed, and even those nobles who hated her most intensely were compelled to admit that she had proven herself worthy of respect through trials that would have destroyed lesser beings. But the vote was about more than just determining the winner of their deadly game, because the choice they made would establish whether vampire society could evolve beyond its purely predatory nature, or if it would remain locked in ancient patterns that demanded constant conflict with the human world. Progressive nobles, who had grown weary of endless cycles of violence and retaliation, saw in Maya's victory the possibility of a different future, while traditionalists, who viewed any change as weakness, fought to preserve the old ways that had given them dominance for millennia. The debate raged through the night with the intensity of theological argument, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of power and the responsibilities that came with immortal existence, before the final vote was cast by Lord Aldrich, the oldest member of the court whose opinion carried weight that could sway entire factions. When he declared his support for Maya, acknowledging that her victory had been earned through trials that proved her worthiness to stand as equal rather than prey, the decision was sealed with the finality of natural law. Damien did not rage or resist as some had expected when faced with the prospect of kneeling before a mortal hunter, and instead something that looked almost like relief crossed his ancient features, as if a burden he had carried for centuries was finally lifting from shoulders that had grown weary under the weight of absolute power and the isolation it demanded. The moment had come for him to kneel in acknowledgement of defeat and acceptance of whatever terms Maya might choose to impose. But as she looked down at the vampire king who had become something far more complex than the monster she had originally hunted, victory felt hollow and incomplete, because destroying someone she had come to understand would diminish the world rather than improve it. Before the assembled vampire court that filled the great hall with centuries of accumulated power and malevolent intelligence, Damien slowly lowered himself to one knee before Maya, in a gesture that sent shockwaves rippling through the supernatural world like an earthquake that would reshape everything mortals and immortals thought they knew about the natural order. The ancient vampire king, who had never bowed to any authority in over a millennium, was acknowledging defeat at the hands of a mortal hunter, his dark head bent in submission that spoke of fundamental changes in the balance between predator and prey that had governed their respective species since the dawn of recorded history. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear individual heartbeats among the mortal servants, the soft whisper of silk against stone as nobles shifted in their seats, and the distant sound of wind howling through castle towers, like the voices of ancient ghosts bearing witness to this unprecedented moment. Maya stood above him with victory finally within her grasp, the culmination of 3 centuries spent hunting the creature who had destroyed her family and shaped her entire existence around the pursuit of vengeance. Yet she found no satisfaction in the triumph that should have felt like justice finally served after endless years of patient stalking. Instead of savoring the moment when the monster who had haunted her dreams would kneel in acknowledgement of her superiority, she extended her hand to help him rise, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose to a court that viewed humans as nothing more than convenient food sources. She announced that she claimed her victory not to humiliate the vampire king or demand his execution as payment for centuries of accumulated crimes, but to propose something that had never been attempted in the long and bloody history between their kinds, a new alliance that could reshape the relationship between supernatural and human worlds. The constant warfare that had defined their existence for millennia was not inevitable, she declared to a court that had built its power on assumptions of natural superiority and the right of the strong to prey upon the weak without consequence or moral consideration. They could find a different path forward, one where supernatural strength served justice rather than cruelty, where ancient wisdom was used to protect rather than exploit, where the gifts that immortality provided could benefit all rather than enriching only those fortunate enough to possess fangs and enhanced abilities. Damien stared at her extended hand for a long moment that stretched like eternity while the assembled court held its collective breath, waiting to see whether their king would accept this unprecedented offer or strike down the mortal who dared suggest that centuries of tradition might be replaced by something entirely new. When his pale fingers finally closed around hers, the contact sent ripples of possibility through both their beings, sealing a pact that neither fully understood yet, but both desperately wanted to attempt. A partnership between natural enemies that might offer hope for a future where strength and compassion could coexist rather than remaining forever locked in cycles of violence and retribution. The vampire court split over this unprecedented development, like a crystal struck by lightning, fractures spreading through alliances that had remained stable for centuries, as progressive nobles saw opportunity to evolve beyond their purely predatory existence, while traditionalists began plotting rebellion against what they viewed as contamination of their ancient and superior nature. Maya found herself caught between 2 worlds that both rejected her presence, human hunters who saw her alliance with Damien as the ultimate betrayal of everything their order had fought to preserve, while vampires viewed her as an existential threat to the hierarchies that had given their society structure and meaning for over 1,000 years. Messages arrived from hunter sanctuaries across the continent, denouncing her as a traitor who had sold her soul for vampire promises. Her name struck from records, and her achievements dismissed as the delusions of someone who had fallen under supernatural influence, rather than maintained the purity of purpose that defined their calling. Meanwhile, vampire nobles whispered in shadowed alcoves about the weakness their king had shown by submitting to mortal demands, questioning whether someone who knelt to a human could still claim the authority to rule creatures who had transcended mortality through strength and cunning rather than compromise and sentiment. Damien faced challenges to his authority for the first time in centuries as traditionalist factions began testing the boundaries of his power, sending subtle insults disguised as questions about policy while positioning themselves to exploit any further signs of what they considered contamination by human values. When assassins from both sides struck simultaneously on a night when storm clouds gathered like omens of approaching chaos, Maya and Damien found themselves fighting back to back against enemies who represented everything they had once been before their impossible alliance changed the fundamental nature of their existence. Hunter blades blessed with holy power sought Maya's heart, while vampire claws aimed for Damien's throat, both sides united in their determination to destroy what they could not understand or control, forcing the unlikely partners to rely on each other for survival in ways that would have been unthinkable mere weeks earlier. Their coordination in combat had evolved beyond the tactical cooperation they had discovered while defending the village, becoming something deeper and more instinctive that allowed them to anticipate each other's movements and cover weaknesses with the precision of warriors who had fought together for decades, rather than enemies who had recently discovered common cause. As dawn approached and the last assassin fell to their combined assault, Maya and Damien realized that their alliance had indeed made them enemies to everyone who preferred the familiar patterns of ancient hatred, but they were no longer alone in a world that seemed determined to force them back into roles as predator and prey rather than allowing them to explore possibilities that neither side had previously imagined could exist. Maya and Damien worked together through long nights and careful days to establish new laws that would protect both humans and vampires, while creating framework for coexistence that challenged every assumption their respective societies had built around the necessity of eternal conflict. Voluntary blood donation replaced predation as the primary means of vampire sustenance, with willing humans providing what immortal beings needed to survive in exchange for protection from supernatural threats that lurked in darkness beyond mortal comprehension or ability to combat. Ancient vampire knowledge accumulated over centuries of existence was applied to solving human problems like disease and famine, medical understanding enhanced by supernatural perception, while agricultural techniques benefited from the kind of long-term planning that only immortal beings could truly appreciate and implement effectively. Supernatural strength was redirected toward community protection rather than personal aggrandizement, with vampire abilities used to defend settlements from raiders and monsters, rather than terrorizing populations for entertainment or easy feeding opportunities that had characterized their relationship with mortals for millennia. The new society was not perfect because old hatreds died harder than the bodies that had once contained them, and there were setbacks and betrayals from both sides, as individuals and factions rejected changes that threatened their traditional sources of power and satisfaction. Human settlements sometimes reneged on agreements when fear overcame rational consideration of mutual benefit, while vampire nobles occasionally succumbed to ancient appetites that demanded the kind of casual cruelty their new laws explicitly forbade, creating incidents that threatened to unravel the delicate web of trust Maya and Damien had spent months carefully constructing. But slowly, and with infinite patience, a new society began emerging from the ashes of the old, built on principles that neither species had previously considered possible or desirable, when strength alone had been sufficient to determine who lived and who died according to the whims of those powerful enough to enforce their will through violence. Maya became something unprecedented in the history of either world, a hunter who protected vampires from other hunters, rather than seeking their destruction, using her knowledge of supernatural weaknesses to defend, rather than exploit those vulnerabilities when traditionalist forces sought to destroy the alliances she had helped create. Damien transformed from a tyrant who ruled through fear and casual violence into a leader who served the needs of both human and vampire communities, his authority now derived from respect rather than terror, as he demonstrated that true strength could be measured by what one chose to protect, rather than what one conquered or destroyed. Their relationship remained complex, in ways that defied easy categorization, not quite love as mortals understood the concept, and not quite friendship as either species had previously defined such bonds, but something entirely new that drew its strength from mutual respect earned through trials that had tested every assumption they had held about themselves and their supposed enemies. A partnership that offered hope for futures neither had dared imagine when their contest began, with silver pressed against an immortal throat. 1 year after their first encounter had shattered every assumption both had held about the nature of their eternal conflict, Maya and Damien stood once again in the same Gothic cathedral where they had first been bound together in a ceremony that was supposed to end with her death and his amusement. But this time the vows they exchanged carried the weight of genuine devotion, rather than theatrical cruelty, designed to entertain a court that thrived on mortal suffering. The assembled crowd that filled the ancient pews represented something unprecedented in the history of either species, humans and vampires sitting side by side in harmony that would have been impossible to imagine before their unlikely alliance proved that former enemies could indeed unite in building something better than the cycles of violence and retribution that had defined their relationship for millennia. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows that had been carefully modified to filter out the wavelengths that would harm vampire flesh, creating patterns of colored light that danced across faces both mortal and immortal, while priests from both human and supernatural traditions officiated over a ceremony that blended ancient rituals into something entirely new and hopeful. When they exchanged vows that had been written together during long nights of discussion about the future they wanted to create, Maya did not hold a silver blade to Damien's throat, as she had during their first meeting, but instead placed her hand over his still heart and promised to help him remember what it meant to truly live rather than merely exist as a predator sustained by the suffering of others. Her voice carried across the cathedral with the clear certainty of someone who had found purpose beyond vengeance, speaking words that acknowledged both the darkness he had embraced and the light she had witnessed growing within him during their months of building a new society from the ashes of the old. Damien, for his part, knelt again before her as he had when acknowledging defeat. But this time the gesture carried no shame or submission, only genuine devotion to the woman who had saved him from the monster he had become, and offered him the possibility of redemption through service to something greater than his own immortal desires. His vows spoke of the man he had been before vampire curse claimed him, the protector and leader he wanted to become again, and the love that had awakened in his undead heart like spring flowers pushing through winter snow, proving that even creatures who had transcended mortality could still grow and change when shown the proper example of what strength truly meant. The ceremony concluded not with the traditional kiss between bride and groom, but with both kneeling together before the altar while their assembled guests, human and vampire alike, rose to their feet in acknowledgement of a union that represented hope for futures. Neither species had dared imagine possible when hatred and fear were the only emotions that connected their worlds. Maya and Damien ruled together over a transformed realm where supernatural beings and humans coexisted under carefully crafted laws that protected both species while fostering cooperation that benefited everyone willing to abandon old prejudices in favor of mutual prosperity and security. The kingdom that had once been synonymous with vampire tyranny and human oppression became a beacon of hope that drew refugees and seekers from across the continent, mortals fleeing persecution, and immortals tired of existence defined solely by predation and cruelty, gathering under the protection of rulers who proved that strength could serve justice rather than personal ambition. Maya had established new hunter orders throughout their territory, organizations that focused on protecting the innocent from genuine threats rather than pursuing the extermination of all supernatural beings, regardless of their actions or intentions, training centers where young people learned to distinguish between monsters who chose evil and beings who simply happened to possess abilities beyond mortal limitations. These reformed hunters worked alongside vampire guardians to patrol the borders and investigate reports of supernatural disturbances, their combined expertise creating security networks more effective than anything either species had achieved alone. Damien used his ancient knowledge and accumulated wisdom to revolutionize human understanding of medicine and agriculture, sharing techniques that had been hoarded by vampire nobility for centuries while applying immortal perspective to problems that required long-term planning beyond the scope of mortal lifespans. Diseases that had plagued humanity for generations yielded to treatments developed through supernatural insight, while agricultural innovations increased crop yields enough to eliminate famine from their territories and provide surplus that could be traded with neighboring kingdoms in exchange for resources and diplomatic recognition. Their castle served as neutral ground where former enemies could meet and find common cause, hosting conferences where human scholars debated philosophy with vampire intellectuals, while merchants from both species negotiated trade agreements that would have been impossible when fear and hatred were the primary emotions governing interspecies relations. When reports arrived of new supernatural threats in distant lands, creatures that preyed upon both human and vampire communities without discrimination or mercy, Maya and Damien set out together at the head of combined forces that represented everything their alliance had achieved. Hunter and vampire, equals and partners, they rode toward whatever darkness awaited with the confidence that came from having faced their greatest enemies within themselves, and emerged victorious, ready to extend the peace they had built to other regions that still suffered under the old systems of eternal conflict and mutual destruction. The story of Maya and Damien ended not with the traditional happily ever after that marked the conclusion of simpler tales, but with recognition that their achievement represented a new beginning rather than a final destination, the first chapter in a larger story about the possibility of change and growth that could transform entire civilizations if given time and nurturing care. Maya now bore some vampire traits through the mystical bond that had formed between them during their year of building trust and partnership. Her human lifespan extended and her physical abilities enhanced, while her essential humanity remained intact, creating something unprecedented that bridged the gap between mortal and immortal existence. Damien had learned to embrace the best aspects of his vampire nature, while controlling the darker impulses that had once defined his existence, using immortal strength and accumulated wisdom in service of protection and justice, rather than domination and casual cruelty, proving that even creatures who had transcended mortality could choose to become better than their origins suggested was possible. Their love story had become legend that spread across the supernatural world like ripples from stones cast into still water, carried by merchants and travelers to courts and councils, where the impossible alliance between hunter and vampire was debated by scholars and philosophers seeking to understand how ancient enemies had found common ground strong enough to support lasting peace. The tale offered proof that even the deepest hatreds could be overcome if individuals were willing to see beyond the prejudices and assumptions that tradition insisted were immutable laws of nature, inspiring others to question whether conflicts they had accepted as inevitable might also be susceptible to resolution through courage and compromise, rather than endless cycles of violence and retribution. As they walked hand in hand through the transformed kingdom they had built together, Maya reflected that she had set out to kill a monster and ended up saving a man, while Damien realized that he had chosen her as a victim and found instead a partner who made him worthy of the redemption he had secretly craved for centuries without daring to believe it could ever be achieved. Their wedding night had indeed made him kneel as the title of their legend proclaimed, but not in submission to superior force or the humiliation of defeat. Rather in recognition that true strength came from choosing love over power, protection over predation, and the difficult work of building something better over the easy satisfaction of destroying what already existed, lessons that would guide their rule for centuries to come as they continued writing new chapters in the ongoing story of what became possible when enemies chose to become partners in creating the kind of world both had always secretly wanted but never believed they deserved to inherit or help create for future generations, who would benefit from their courage to attempt the impossible.